The first thing that went wrong was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, mind you. Not the gentle hush of a sleeping world. This was a thick, woolly quiet, the kind that presses in on your eardrums until they ache. A void so absolute it felt like the air itself had been stuffed with cotton. It was the third night the power had been out on our little dead-end street. And this new silence felt different. It felt hungry. It had a weight to it. A presence that sat in the corner of the room and watched you with patient, unseen eyes. My name's Eli. I was house-sitting for my Aunt Celia while she was on some cruise she'd won through a radio call-in contest. A stroke of luck, she'd called it. Her voice buzzing with static over the phone, a sound I'd give anything to hear now. Just keep an eye on the place. Water the ficus. The ficus was already looking pretty grim, its leaves a dry, papery brown, rattling like tiny bones when the wind blew, back when the wind still made a sound. The house was a squat, brick-faced ranch at the very end of Hemlock Drive, where the asphalt gave up and melted back into the dense West Virginia woods, the kind of place where the dark, when it fell, was absolute, a tangible thing you could feel on your skin like a cold film. The storm that knocked out the grid had been a real shrieker, a tantrum of thunder and lashing rain that seemed to want to peel the shingles from the roof. But it had passed. The trouble was the power hadn't come back on. No one's cell phones worked, the screens as dark and dead as a shark's eye. The landline was a cold plastic corpse in my hand. And last night, old Mr. Henderson from 2 houses down had wandered over, his face the color of old parchment in the jittery beam of my flashlight. "The wires," he'd whispered, his breath pluming in the unheated air like a ghost leaving his body. "I was out with Buster before it got full dark. The lines are down, all right. But Eli, they ain't cut. They're pulled, like something with immense, patient strength had yanked them right out of the poles, slow and steady like a gardener pulling a stubborn weed." I'd written it off to the panic of an old man, a mind frayed by the unnatural dark. But now, on this third night, sitting in Aunt Celia's overstuffed living room with only the guttering light of a dozen candles for company, I couldn't shake his words. The silence was the second thing. The third thing was the scratching. It started soft, a dry, skittering sound from the wall behind the sofa, right near the floorboard where the baseboard had a long, dark crack. I froze, my book, some forgettable thriller forgotten in my lap. A rat, I thought, clinging to the shreds of normalcy. Just a goddamn rat in the walls, a big one. The old house was a chorus of settling noises and nocturnal creaks, a symphony of aging timber. But this was different. This was deliberate, purposeful. It came again, a little louder, more insistent. Scritch, scritch, scratch. Pause. Scritch, scritch, scratch. It was a pattern, a code being tapped out by something that knew it had an audience. I stood up, my heart hammering a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs. I picked up the heavy metal flashlight from the coffee table. Its cool weight a small comfort, my knuckles straining white against my skin. The sound wasn't just coming from one place anymore. It echoed from the wall behind me. Then from the ceiling above, a dissonant chorus of scraping that seemed to be moving, circling me. I swung the flashlight beam around the room, the shadows leaping and twisting like mad things freed from a cage. Scritch, scritch, scratch. It was right behind me, at eye level now. I spun, pointing the light at the floor-to-ceiling bookcase. The sound was coming from inside it, from behind a row of my aunt's romance novels, books with swooning women on the covers, their faces frozen in perpetual vapid ecstasy. I took a shaky step forward. As I watched, a thick, leather-bound volume of Wuthering Heights twitched on the shelf. Then, with a slow, grinding push, it was forced out, tumbling to the floor with a muffled, final thud. From the dark, book-shaped space it left behind, something peered out. It wasn't a rat. It was a face, but all wrong, a cruel parody carved by a blind sculptor. The skin was the color and texture of old, damp newspaper, crinkled and stained. It had no eyes, just smooth, shallow depressions that seemed to drink the light. Its mouth was a lipless slit, far too wide, stretching from one side of its head to the other, and it was smiling. A fixed, rigid smile of pure, placid malevolence. I stumbled back, a strangled cry caught in my throat, a bird trapped in a cage of bone. The thing didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. It just kept smiling that terrible, empty smile from the darkness between the books. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw another one. A section of the faded floral print wallpaper bulged, the pattern of roses and vines distorting, stretching like skin over a swelling infection. Another of those papery faces pressed through from the other side, its head emerging like a turtle from its shell, its blind gaze sweeping the room before fixing on me. They were in the walls. They had been in the walls all along. I ran. I didn't think, I just ran, my body moving on pure animal instinct. I burst out the front door and into the cold, damp night, the wooden frame splintering as I yanked it open. The air should have been a relief, but it was just as heavy, just as silent, and cold enough to steal my breath. The street was a tunnel of profound darkness, the other houses standing like silent tombstones in a forgotten cemetery. No lights, no sounds of generators, no distant hum of a highway. Nothing. The world had been muted. And then I saw them. Figures. Dozens of them. They stood in the middle of the street, in the overgrown yards, on the porches of my neighbors' homes. They were tall and gaunt, their limbs too long and thin, their bodies seeming to absorb the scant light from the cloud-shrouded moon, a deeper black against the blackness. They were perfectly still, their heads tilted at identical, unnatural angles, as if listening to a single silent command. They had no faces, just smooth, blank skin where their features should have been, a void more terrifying than any monstrous visage. One of them, standing right in the center of the road where kids used to draw hopscotch squares, slowly raised an arm. It wasn't a hand at the end, but a single, long, and wickedly sharp spike of bone that gleamed with a faint, oily sheen. That's when the screaming started. It was thin and high, a sound of pure, undiluted terror that tore through the silence like a razor. It came from the Henderson house. It was old Mr. Henderson, or maybe his wife. The scream climbed, peaked, and was cut off with a wet, final crunch that was somehow both soft and deafeningly loud. I stood there, frozen on my aunt's porch, a scream trapped in my own chest, a solid block of ice in my lungs. The faceless things began to move, their motion a silent, gliding shuffle that made no sound on the gravel and asphalt. They converged on the Henderson house. I saw one of them simply melt through the solid wood of the front door, its body flowing like liquid shadow, its form losing all cohesion before reforming on the other side. I had to get back inside. It was the only thought in my head, a primal need for walls, for a barrier, however flimsy. I scrambled back into the house, slamming the door and throwing the deadbolt with trembling hands. I backed away, my breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps that sounded obscenely loud in the quiet. The scratching from the walls had stopped. It was worse now. It was awaiting silence, a listening silence. I grabbed a heavy kitchen chair and shoved it under the doorknob, a pathetic, laughable barricade against what was outside. I ran to the window and peered through a crack in the blinds. The things outside were hurting. They were moving down the street, their gliding forms pushing something, no, someone, ahead of them. It was Mrs. Gable from number 4. She was stumbling, her hands over her face, her body racked with sobs I could see but not hear. The things surrounded her, their spiked arms held out, not touching her, but corralling her, a living fence, guiding her towards the dark, waiting maw of the woods. She disappeared into the tree line, and the silent, faceless sentinels followed, vanishing one by one into the blackness. The street was empty again, a stage after the actors had departed. A soft, wet thud came from the other side of the front door. I jumped, pressing my back against the wall, the floral pattern of the wallpaper feeling like a million tiny, crawling insects against my skin. The thud came again, thump, thump, like a heavy, sodden weight being dropped against the wood. Then a voice. It was Mr. Henderson's voice, or a perfect copy of it, but it was wrong. It was flat, drained of all emotion, all life, like a recording played on a dying battery. "Eli," it called. "Eli, son, are you in there? Let me in. It's cold out here, so cold." I didn't move. I couldn't breathe. My lungs refused to function. "Eli," the voice continued, that dull, monotonous drone. "My dog Buster. I can't find Buster. Have you seen him? He's a good boy." Thump. A darker stain began to seep under the door, spreading slowly across the welcome mat. "Let me in, Eli. I need to find my dog." I inched closer to the door, my body moving against my will, my eye finding the distorted fisheye lens of the peephole. I leaned in, my heart a frantic, trapped bird beating against the cage of my ribs. Mr. Henderson was standing there. Or what was left of him. His clothes were torn and soaked with something dark and viscous. His head was tilted at that same impossible broken neck angle as the tall things. And his face was gone. It was just a smooth, blank expanse of skin, still flecked with his white beard stubble, a grotesque canvas of erased identity. The voice was coming from a slit that opened and closed just below where his chin should be, a raw red gash in the flesh. "Let me in, Eli." I screamed then, a raw, tearing sound that ripped from my throat, and stumbled away from the door. I ran through the house into the kitchen, my mind a white-hot panic, looking for a way out, a weapon, anything. The back door was my only hope. I flung it open, the knob cracking against the wall, and I saw where they were taking everyone. I saw the heart of the silence. At the edge of the woods, just beyond the scraggly lawn, the ground was moving. It was a vast, pulsating mound of earth, maybe 30 feet across, like a giant. Breathing lung buried just beneath the surface. The soil churned and shifted, black and wet and stuck into it. Half absorbed into the loam were people. I recognized Mrs. Gable. She was buried up to her waist, her head thrown back, her mouth open in a silent, eternal scream. As I watched, frozen in horror, the earth around her writhed, and she was pulled down another few inches, the soil closing over her thighs like a thick, hungry mud. Next to her was a teenager, a boy named Kyle I'd seen skateboarding just days ago. He was in up to his chest. His eyes were open, staring at nothing, already losing their color, fading to a dull gray. His face was beginning to smooth out, the nose dissolving, the mouth sealing shut, the features slowly being erased like a chalk drawing in the rain. The mound wasn't just earth. It was a digestive tract, a processor. It was consuming them, erasing them, digesting their identities and their physical forms, turning them into more of those blank, faceless things or the papery wall dwellers. It was the source. The factory of forgetting. I slammed the door shut and vomited onto the linoleum floor, the acidic taste of bile and terror filling my mouth. There was no way out. They were in the walls. They were outside the doors. They were in the very earth. We were caught in a trap that had been laid not around us, but beneath us for who knows how long. I retreated to the basement, the one place in the house that felt remotely safe, only because it was made of cold, solid concrete, a bunker against the world. I huddled in a corner, surrounded by my aunt's canned preserves, jars of peaches and pickles that now looked like specimens in a lab, and boxes of forgotten Christmas decorations, the jolly Santa faces now seeming like masks of mockery. The beam of my flashlight was my only comfort, a tiny, fragile spear of light in an ocean of ink. The scratching started up again, faint at first, then louder, more aggressive. It was coming from the foundation wall, the one that backed onto the woods. Scritch, scritch, scratch, scritch. I pointed the light. The concrete was sweating, beaded with moisture that looked black in the beam. A patch of it near the floor was darkening, turning soft. The solid stone becoming porous and malleable. A long, papery finger, the same color as the thing in the bookcase, pushed its way through the wall as if it were wet clay. Then another. They were digging through. The concrete was offering no more resistance than wet cardboard. I was so focused on the horror in front of me, on those probing, questing fingers, that I didn't notice the temperature plummeting. A freezing cold seeped into the room, a cold that had nothing to do with the power being out. A deep, soul-chilling frost that came from somewhere else entirely. My breath plumed thickly in the flashlight beam, and the air grew sharp with the smell of ozone and damp soil. And then a new sound started. A soft, staticky whisper like a radio tuned between stations, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very air, from the cold concrete floor, from inside my own head. At first it was just noise, a chaotic hiss. Then a voice broke through, fragmented, desperate. A tiny, frantic voice, layered over with hissing static that clawed at the edges of the words. Anyone? Is anyone receiving? Please. The wires. They're not just down. They're alive. They're using the wires, the pipes, the pathways It was my Aunt Celia's voice. My blood ran colder than the air. It was her, but it was a version of her from a place of ultimate terror. "Aunt Celia," I whispered, my voice a dry, trembling leaf. "Where are you?" The static surged, swallowing her words, then spat her out again, clearer, closer, as if she were right next to me. Her mouth pressed against my ear. "Eli? Eli, is that you? Oh, God, don't be there. Don't be in the house!" It wasn't a contest. It was a selection. They pick a house, an anchor point. They pull the past through. They thin the veil. Through the wires, the pipes, the memories in the walls. They feed on the silence we leave behind. The things scratching at the foundation wall redoubled their efforts. A chunk of concrete the size of my fist fell away with a dry crunch, and that wide, lipless smile appeared in the hole. Larger now, closer. The static from the unseen radio screamed, "They're not coming in, Eli." My aunt's voice crackled, fading in and out, stretching into a digital whine. They're already in. They've always been in the silence between the sounds. In the dark behind your eyes when you blink. In the spaces between your thoughts. They're just making room for themselves now, turning off the noise, so we can hear them, so we can finally see what was always there, hiding in the corners of our world. The flashlight in my hand flickered violently. The batteries, my last tie to the world of light, were dying. The beam wavered, strobing, and in those frantic flashes of illumination, I saw the truth. The walls of the basement were no longer concrete. They had become transparent like smoky, warped glass, and behind them, packed tight like sardines in a can, stretching back into an impossible infinity, were countless figures, legions of them. The papery ones, all smiling their identical vacant smiles. The tall, faceless ones, standing in silent, endless rows. An infinite patient audience, waiting in the spaces between the walls of the world. In the gaps in reality itself. We hadn't been invaded. We had simply become aware of the permanent tenants. The flashlight died with a final sputtering cough. The scratching stopped. In the perfect, absolute hungry dark that followed, something in the corner of the basement, the corner where the shadows had always been the deepest, began to breathe. It was a slow, wet, rattling sound, the sound of lungs filled with mud, and then a voice spoke. It wasn't from the wires. It was right in front of me, inches from my face. It used my own voice, pulled from some deep, private part of my memory, mimicking the way I'd sounded as a scared child calling for my mother. "It's okay," it said, with my mouth, my cadence, a perfect, loving forgery. "It's quieter now. Isn't it better? No more noise. No more faces to remember, no more thoughts to trouble you, no more self. Just the quiet. The beautiful, endless quiet." I felt a cold, smooth hand, like polished river stone, lay itself against my cheek. The touch was almost gentle, a lover's caress. It started to press. I felt the bone of my jaw, the architecture of my face, begin to groan under the steady, inexorable pressure. I tried to scream, but I had no air, no voice. My thoughts began to simplify, to flatten. The complex tapestry of my life, my fears, my loves, my regrets, unraveling into single, frayed threads before snapping all together. The terror was being pressed out of me, replaced by a vast, empty calm, a profound and welcoming numbness. The last thing I was aware of was the feeling of my features, my eyes, my nose, my mouth, the very map of my identity, slowly, gently being smoothed away into a blank, placid canvas, and the only thought left in my mind, a final, fading spark before the permanent silence closed over me forever, was a simple, profound understanding that brought not fear, but a weary, final relief. They weren't invaders from outside. They were the foundation upon which our noisy, frantic world was built. And now the foundation was claiming its due.